Ancient Egypt was a civilization of ancient Northeast Africa. It was concentrated along the lower reaches of the Nile River, situated within the contemporary territory of modern-day Egypt. Ancient Egyptian civilization followed prehistoric Egypt and coalesced around 3100 BC, with the political unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under Pharaoh or King Menes. The history of ancient Egypt unfolded as a series of stable kingdoms interspersed by periods of relative instability known as intermediate periods. The various kingdoms fell into one of three categories: the Old Kingdom of the Early Bronze Age, the Middle Kingdom of the Middle Bronze Age, or the New Kingdom of the Late Bronze Age. Ancient Egypt reached the pinnacle of its power during the New Kingdom, ruling much of Nubia and sizable portion of Levant. After this period, it entered an era of slow decline. During the course of its history, ancient Egypt was invaded or conquered by a number of foreign powers, including the Hyksos, the Nubians, the Assyrians, the Achaemenid Persians, and the Macedonians under Alexander the Great. The Greek Ptolemaic kingdom formed in the aftermath of Alexander's death, ruled until 30 BC, when under Cleopatra it fell to the Roman Empire and became a Roman province. Egypt remained under Roman control until 642 AD, when it was conquered by the Rashidun Caliphate. The success of ancient Egyptian civilization came partly from its ability to adapt to the conditions of the Nile River Valley for agriculture. The predictable flooding and controlled irrigation of the fertile valley produced surplus crops, which supported a more dense population and social development and culture. With resources to spare, the administration sponsored mineral exploitation of the valley and surrounding desert regions. The early development of independent writing system, the organization of collective construction and agricultural projects, trade with surrounding regions, and a military intended to assert Egyptian dominance. Motivating and organizing these activities was a bureaucracy of elite scribes, religious leaders, and administrators under the control of Pharaoh, who ensured the cooperation and unity of the Egyptian people in the context of elaborate system of religious beliefs. The many achievements of the ancient Egyptians include the quarrying, surveying, and the construction techniques that support the building of monumental pyramids, temples, and obelisks, a system of mathematics, a practical and effective system of medicine, irrigation systems, and agricultural production techniques, the first known planked boats, Egyptian faience and glass technology, new forms of literature, and the earliest known peace treaty made with the Hittites. Ancient Egypt has left a lasting legacy. Its art and architecture were widely copied, and its antiquities were carried off to be studied, admired, or coveted in the far corners of the world. Its monumental ruins have inspired the imagination of the travelers and writers for millennia. A newfound respect for antiquities and excavation in the early modern period by Europeans and Egyptians has led to the scientific investigation of Egyptian civilization and a greater appreciation of its cultural legacy.
Gods were worshipped in cult temples administered by priests acting on the king's behalf. At the center of the temple was a cult statue in a shrine. Temples were not places for public worship or congregation, and only on select feast days and celebrations was a shrine carrying the statue of the god brought out for public worship. Normally, the god's domain was sealed off from the outside world and was only accessible to temple officials. Common citizens could worship private statues in their homes, and amulets offered protection against the herds of cows. After the New Kingdom, the pharaoh's role as spiritual intermediary was emphasized as religious customs shifted to direct worship of the gods. As a result, priests developed a system of oracles to communicate the will of the gods directly to the people. The Egyptians believed that every human being was composed of physical and spiritual parts or aspects. In addition to the body, each person had a shadow, personality or soul, life force, and a name. The heart rather than the brain was considered the set of thoughts and emotions. After death, the spiritual aspects were released from the body and could move at will, but they required a physical remains, such as statue, as a permanent home. The ultimate goal of this deceased was to rejoin his soul and life force and become one of the blessed dead. For this to happen, the deceased had to be judged worthy in a trial, in which the heart was weighed against the fetter of truth. If deemed worthy, the deceased could continue their existence on earth in spiritual form. If they were not deemed worthy, their heart was eaten by Amit the Devourer, and they were erased from the universe. Beliefs in the divine and in the afterlife were ingrained in ancient Egyptian civilization from its inception. Pharaonic rule was based on the divine right of kings. The Egyptian pantheon was populated by gods who had supernatural powers and were called on for help or protection. However, the gods were not always viewed as benevolent. The Egyptians believed they had to be appeased with offerings and prayers. The structure of this pantheon changed continually as new deities were promoted in the hierarchy. But priests made no effort to organize the diverse and sometimes conflicting myths and stories into a coherent system. These various conceptions of divinity were not considered contradictory, but rather layers in the multiple facets of reality. The ancient Egyptians maintained an elaborate set of burial customs that they believed were necessary to ensure immortality after death. These customs involved preserving the body by mummification, performing burial ceremonies, and interring with the body goods the deceased would use in the afterlife. Before the Old Kingdom, bodies buried in desert pits were naturally preserved by desiccation. The arid desert conditions were abundant throughout the history of ancient Egypt for burials of the poor, who could not afford the elaborate burial preparations available to the elite. Wealthier Egyptians began to bury their dead in stone tombs and use artificial mummification, which involved removing the internal organs, wrapping the body in linen, and burying in a rectangular stone sarcophagus or wooden coffin. Beginning in the first dynasty, some parts were preserved separately in canopic jars. By the New Kingdom, the ancient Egyptians had perfected the art of mummification. The best technique took 70 days and involved removing the internal organs, removing the brain through the nose, and desiccating the body in a mixture of salt, skeleton, natron. The body was then wrapped in linen with protective amulets inserted between layers and placed in a decorated anthropoid coffin. Mummies of the late period were also placed in painted cartoonish mummy cases. Actual preservation practices declined during the Ptolemaic and Roman eras, while greater emphasis was placed on the outer appearance of the mummy, which was decorated. The pyramids are giant tombs. Each side is triangular and they meet in a point at the top. The most famous is the Great Pyramid of Giza, at 480 feet high, made from 2.3 million large blocks. The Great Pyramid of Giza is around 4,600 years old. It was the tallest human-made structure in the world for 3,800 years. After it was finished, it was covered in white limestone. There were 3 chambers and 2 entrances. However, the inside was looted and nothing remains except for some large sarcophags of the early pharaohs. The Great Pyramid was part of a group of pyramids outside Giza, which also included the Great Sphinx. Thanks for your attention and subscribe to get more videos.